The Week in Bible Prophecy, a Prophecy Watchers podcast.
I'm Gary Stearman. With me, Dr. Thomas Ice, and in front of me, I have a book called The Case for Zionism. And you have, Dr. Ice, or may I call you what everybody else does, Tommy?
You may.
Tommy, you've written this book, and I think it's very timely, and this is a subject that needs to be clarified.
It does. In fact, the reason we call it Zionism instead of just Israel is Zionism is the modern movement that began 150 years ago or so that resulted in the reestablishment of Israel. Also in the Bible, the term Zionism is used over 100 times. And it when it uses that, it sometimes refers to Jerusalem, it sometimes refers to the nation of Israel, but it's got kind of an optimistic context throughout Scripture. You know, like Christ is going to come and reign from Zion.
Yes.
And, you know, in the future and everything. And as opposed to Israel, you know, fits whatever, you know, the context is talking about in a particular book.
Well, growing up, I want to run something past you. Growing up, I often heard, you know, as I was a toddler in church, and I would hear the phrase, God's chosen people, in conjunction with the Jews. And they were more often referred to, at least in the circles that I kept growing up, they were more often referred to as God's chosen people than they were Jews. And today that phrase, God's chosen people, has kind of dropped off into oblivion. But they're still, I guess, God's chosen people. In what way are they God's chosen people?
Well, that goes back to the Abrahamic covenant, you know, land, seed, and blessing. That part of it is they have a particular real estate that was given to them. Secondly, that through Abraham and his descendants, they're going to be a global blessing, and that includes the Messiah coming, Jesus, and everything. And that's the third one, the blessing. And even today, the largest religion in the world is Christendom. Christendom refers to everything and anything related to Christianity, cults and all of that. And there's actually 500 million more Christians than Muslims. See, sometimes they'll try to tell you Muslims are the largest thing, but in one sense, Islam has some elements of the Bible in it, you see, or the Quran and all of that kind of stuff. But so the influence of Israel in the world is often spoken of in the Bible as Zionism or Zion, and it's spoken very affectionately throughout the Bible of Zion with a future look.
I remember a historic event called the First Zionist Congress. And I've read about that in several books.
1897.
1897. And there may be some people who have never really studied the First Zionist Congress. What happened there?
Well, you know, there's a whole thing leading up to it, and you have this secular guy, Theodor Herzl,
yes,
who was a newspaper guy from Austria, and he was sent to Paris to be the newspaper guy for back in Austria to cover things in France. And he saw what trial was that? Where a French officer who was Jewish was basically stripped and sent to an island in Africa simply because he was Jewish.
Yes, and I remember well, except the name has fled my memory.
Right. And actually 10 years later, he was, they admitted that it was a wrong trial and he was set free. Yeah, even though Herzl was Jewish, he was very secular, And but this opened his eyes, and he said, we need to have a place where the Jews can move to. And so he started the first Zionist conference with that in mind. And he said at the first conference, today I have founded the modern state of Israel. And what he meant was, and these people came from all over the world, Jewish representatives, to these successive conferences that began in 1897. And so they began laying the groundwork for the reestablishment of the modern state of Israel. Now, the European Jews tended to be opposed to Zionism because they felt very comfortable and happy living, in the first world of Europe. And you had a lot of people from Poland and various countries like that in the Eastern Europe were very pro reestablishment of the nation of Israel. And so you've always had a split among Jewish people on reestablishing the modern state of Israel. But it was with the Balfour Declaration in 1919, after World War I, that really got them going.
So there was a lot of conflict that had sort of lain dormant for thousands of years. And suddenly, and the Dreyfus case, it came to mind.
Right,
that was the name that we were fishing for a minute ago.
Yes.
The Dreyfus case stirred the pot just a little bit, but the ingredients were all there, I think is what we should say.
And Herzl died in his early 40s because he worked himself to death. And he kept going to different leaders in Europe to see if they would help reestablish the Jews. And he had various people. One guy that helped him had connection. He was actually British, but he lived in. He was a high-ranking official for the British government, but he was of European descent, and he helped Herzl a lot. And then when Herzl died, the first president of Israel, what was his name? He took over and shepherded the movement. And they, for example, when Israel declared itself a nation, Harry Truman, I call him the cussing Baptist from Missouri, he recognized, 17 minutes later, he recognized Israel. Well, what was interesting, his whole cabinet that he inherited from Roosevelt were totally opposed to it. But a guy named Clark Clifford was his personal assistant. And Clark Clifford very well could have been a believer, from what I've read. He supported Truman. And so they smuggled this guy who was Truman's, who had a haberdashery, they call it, in Kansas City, and he was Jewish, and they smuggled the guy into the White House in a rolled up carpet, and he lobbied at the last minute because Truman didn't want to hear from anybody, and but Truman had read through the Bible 6 times by the time he was 14, and frankly, when I look at his theology, he was probably a social gospel guy, but he knew the Bible and he knew Israel had a future just from his reading of the Bible. And God took out Roosevelt and put Truman in, I think, so that Truman could recognize Israel. And
that 50 years from 1897 to 1947, and you mentioned Theodore Herzl and the First Zionist Congress, and then World War I, and then the 30s with the Nazis coming up to 1947. was a time, I guess you could say, Israel was thrown into a boiling pot. And from God's perspective, Israel was being forced to come back to the land.
Yeah, but the British initially were all for Israel being reestablished, and then other people took over and they fought the reestablishment of the nation of Israel.
And, as I'm listening here and talking with you, there's a theme that just keeps rolling through my mind, and that is Satan hates the Jews.
Oh, yeah.
But God loves the Jews, and he has planned for them. And I go back to 1938 in Germany, Kristallnacht.
Yes.
And you can say, oh, my goodness, that was horrific. That should never have happened. Why did that happen? But then from the other perspective, it was part of a series of events that brought Israel back to the land.
Well, even Martin Luther, the last 5 years of his life, wrote a book called The Jews and Their Lies. He thought early on that the Jews would be open to Protestantism, a new form of the gospel. But he was sorely disappointed, and he became extremely anti-Semitic. Hitler quotes Luther 3 times in Mein Kampf. And so by the time of World War II, you had a secular Lutheran church that was very anti-Semitic and ripe to be taken over. And that's what happened. Now, in Germany, the people that tended to support the Jews were the Plymouth Brethren. And there's whole books I've read about how they would hide many of the Jews, the Plymouth Brethren, in their houses and in their communities and everything. And they saved tens of thousands of Jews in Germany during World War II.
And we know many of them. Close personal friends of yours had to flee.
Right.
And we have watched all this, and this brings us right up to today. Today's television programs, today's television news. Who is shooting rockets at whom?
Right.
That's the theme of the hour. And as I'm listening to you talk, it just occurs to me this is merely a continuation of what's been going on now for 100 years.
Right. And Israel has, a lot of what they've been around 75 years now, roughly. And so many in fact, when I was there, I've been there a number of times over the years, and we would have a general often come and talk to us, like when we were overlooking Armageddon, the Valley of Megiddo.
Right.
And they would talk about how we're tired of wars in Israel, and I'm just hoping my son doesn't have to fight in the IDF and all of this. Well, so they kind of gone through phases where they let down on being ready for the kinds of things that are happening, but they thought that they were going to be able to wipe them out.
Well, going back to the title of your book here, The Case for Zionism, and I'm looking at the table of contents. What is Zionism? We're sort of defining Zionism, but I'm not sure we've fully defined it at this point in time. What exactly is Zionism? And the answer, I think, could be very, very long.
Well, the answer is that it is a movement that wants to see the nation of Israel reestablished and Jews returned to the land, because the word Zionism has usually a positive connotation in its well over 100 uses in the Bible, in the Old Testament. And so therefore, that's why the term Zionism was chosen.
Used the word wants to see Israel back in the land. And as you said that, I had an image in my head that where I'm watching television, and I'm seeing hundreds and even thousands of students marching. and chanting from the river to the sea. And on the one hand, here's Zion. On the other hand, here's anti-Zion, which seems now to be developing at a breakneck pace in all the higher places in the land, financially, academically. What's going on here?
Well, it's 25 years at least of, I call it pagan indoctrination.
Pagan, yeah.
About Israel in the universities and everything. And part of it is these Muslim countries have given billions of dollars to universities, and they have established Islamic studies and all of the, and they so what we're saying is they basically have shifted the American universities to a very anti-Israel thing. And so especially in the Ivy League and various places like this, they where a lot of Jews go because they're smart people, they've started persecuting them. It's finally broken out. And I've noticed in these rallies, probably about 50% of the people in the rally are Muslims, because, and the other half are regular Americans, So they've had an influence on regular Americans, but
let me just interrupt. Would you say that what you're talking about is just the latest iteration of a Bible theme that stretches back for thousands of years?
Yes, except America. Why do we have so many Jews in America? Because historically, America is different. It was not anti-Semitic. In fact, Cotton Mather, you may have heard of him.
Sure.
He wrote a whole book. He only had 450 books published during his lifetime. A real slackard,
What did he do in his spare time?
Well, I don't think he had spare time. But nevertheless, he wrote a whole book about how he would love and ask God that he could lead a Jewish person to Christ. And so they romanticized the Jews early in the Puritans, early in America, and they some people say, well, they taught replacement. No, they didn't. They tried to be like Israel. In fact, at Harvard, Hebrew was taught for the first 5 years, but Greek wasn't.
Really? I didn't know that.
And I'm just saying, you had this tremendous influence in the colonies before we were founded of Jewish and Hebrew influence, and the Americans that came over were very pro-Israel, and we've always been pro-Israel until recent times. But even today, a poll showed just last week that 83% of Americans are still pro-Israel today.
83%?
83%, according to this poll.
Wow.
Scientifically done poll. And it's just that these, all this money coming in from Muslim countries is being used to make, to sponsor all these anti-Israel rallies and to get a lot of the regular American students involved in these kind of protests.
Now, we think back to pre-World War II days and what was happening in Germany and other places in the world, and how God was preparing the Jews for a rush back to the land. I'm looking at chapters 3 and 4 of your book. Chapter 3, Modern Israel's Right to the Land, and that word right interests me. And then the next chapter is Modern Israel's Legal Right to the Land. Two different things here.
Yes, Israel was given the legal right to the land in after World War I, where you had the dividing of the nations, and then they didn't finish dealing with the Middle East. I forget the name of the conference, but they had a separate one in San Remo, Italy, which is very close to Spain. And called the San Remo Conference, in which the Americans were not there because they didn't participate in spite of what Woodrow Wilson wanted. in these kinds of things. But you had Japan and all these other representatives there from World War I who wrote a document that is legal that said that the Jews have the right to, they call it Palestine. I don't like that term. It's Israel.
Well, I think it kind of descends from Philistine.
It does, and it wasn't implemented until AD 135. And that's why I don't like looking in maps and it says Palestine in the time of Christ.
Yeah.
No one, and that's why when we did the Tim LaHaye Prophecy Study Bible, we didn't call it Palestine. We called it Israel.
All right.
Israel in the time of Christ, for example. But these gave, in the international community, in the international courts, the legal right to the land to Israel. And we had a guy at our pre-trib conference one time who's wrote his PhD dissertation at a Swiss University of Geneva, showing that. His dissertation, it's like 1,200 pages, showing that Israel has the legal right to the land, and that's recognized by the international community back at the end of World War I. And of course, they conveniently forget about it later.
You go to legal rights, and as you're talking, in my mind is this vision of an all-night wrestling match between Jacob and the angel of the Lord.
Right.
Let's see, where did that match take place? Oh, right in the heart of Israel.
I've been to that location.
You have been to the location.
Yes, and they had a first century church that was there, and you can stand there because it describes the location in the Bible, and stand there and look at it, and look in the different directions that are described in the context.
Look north, south, east, and west, and you will see what has been given to you.
That's right.
And by the way, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. And, I mean, how do you deal with that? It's as obvious as can be.
Well, you don't. You say, well, that's Old Testament, and the New Testament replacement theology is developed by misinterpreting the New Testament.
And by the way, I was going to ask you that. Your chapter 5 asks the question, what is replacement theology?
Well, it's the belief that the church has replaced Israel, whereas you and I believe that God has at least two plans, one for Israel, one way of salvation, by the way, from all the way back to the beginning, by grace through faith alone.
Well, many people have taught that the church is the new Israel.
Right.
At different times.
And therefore the replacement of Israel. And therefore any future potential prophecy about Israel really refers to the church. And that's what we call replacement theology. The church has forever replaced theology. I just got a 2-volume, 2,000-page book by a guy I've debated who's a preterist and postmillennialist, and the title of the book is The Divorce of Israel.
Preterist. Now, define that word for someone who may not be familiar with it.
Right. There's 4 ways that you can relate to time: past, present, future, timeless.
Okay. And
preterism believes that the book of Revelation and Matthew 24 and all of those were fulfilled in the past, with surrounding the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Okay. Historicism is like the Seventh-day Adventists, and that was a very popular form of premillennialism, in the early 1800s when a lot of the cults were founded.
Yes.
So they're about the only ones that still hold to that the book of Revelation is being fulfilled throughout the church age. So and all we're lacking is Armageddon.
There are a number of complexities that I suppose the enemies of Israel can use for their argumentation. And I think the point of your book is to clarify some of those points.
Yeah, we explain all this in the book, but futurism is the view that we hold, that there's future for Israel and prophecy that's talked about as a future.
Well, we think of the end of the prophet Ezekiel, from chapter 37 to the end of the book.
That's right.
And when you read that, how can you possibly mistake the destiny of Israel?
Well, through replacement thinking. That's how. And saying that you have church tradition on your side, which you do.
Yes.
And then the fourth view is called idealism, and that is a curse on all your houses. These are just abstract ideas. And therefore they're atemporal, meaning there's no time relation. So for example, a friend of mine who was a student at Dallas Seminary who went in this direction, a very well-known scholar, says, Revelation 1:7, Jesus comes, he comes every day, he comes again and again and again every day in many ways, because it talks in Revelation, he's going to come again.
Diluting the idea of that there's a specific prophecy.
Right. And so they're overpowering specificity in the biblical text with ideas.
Well, I would like for you to talk about your chapter 6, which asks a question: are modern Jews descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Now, a lot of people try to make the case that you really can't track the genealogy, and the Jews are a lost people, and they cannot be rediscovered, I suppose. Yeah,
well, the only tribal identity is the ones that are preserved, Levi, or, that have priest in their name, and you can, that has been preserved through last names. All the others have been lost. And so there are people that say that the Jews around the 850s or so, there was a country called Khazaria, and they were surrounded, which is in southern Russia today, by the Mediterranean, or what's that sea, not the Mediterranean, but the
Adriatic.
Sea there. And they didn't, because you had Islam that was a single kingdom, and you had Christendom that was a single kingdom. And they didn't want to be subsumed into those two, one or the other kingdoms. So they converted, their leaders converted to Judaism. And as a result, a number of Jews moved there, and they existed for about 150, 175 years. And they were eventually overrun, and it was primarily the leadership that converted to Judaism, you see, and the other Jews that came were primarily in the leadership. And at the end of their kingdom, when they were overrun by the enemy, they were almost all the leaders were killed and destroyed. And so there are people like some preterists and others that try to say, well, the Khazar theory is that 80% of the Jews are nothing but Gentiles, you see, who converted during that time.
And of course, who would want to establish that thinking?
Well, people that are opposed to our literal view of Scripture.
And behind them would be a great satanic whitewash. And Satan, I'm positive from Scripture, of course, Satan does not want the 12 tribes to continue in existence.
Exactly, but obviously we know from the book of Revelation that God knows who they are.
And that's kind of what I was wanting you to talk about, because there is obviously going to be a total identification of the 12 tribes.
Yeah, well, but I know a guy in Houston who has the largest DNA company in America. And I show that in that chapter, the Jewish people as a whole have this Jewish marker in their DNA, and he has identified that, and he read my chapter on it and thought it was accurate. As the guy with the largest DNA analysis company in America. But nevertheless, so we look at that chapter both historically, and then with DNA that can tell you whether a person has Jewish heritage or not from the analysis of their DNA.
And the way the Lord works is to us very mysterious. I keep going back to 1938 and Kristallnacht. Like, that is usually summed up as the kickoff.
The night of the breaking of glass.
The night of the breaking of glass. And if we can use the phrase, all hell broke loose.
Yes.
At that time. And you could have stood there and watched books being burned and watched people being carted off to be killed. You could say at that time that God has renounced the Jews. He has given them over and they no longer count. They're going to be wiped out. You could have stood there shaking your head and you could have said that. And many did.
Yes.
But we're looking at things from a later viewpoint, and it's amazing to me, looking back to October 7th as we're talking right now, to the present, we see a greater and greater potential for a very large Middle Eastern war, which of course the Bible calls for at some point. And we put all of that together with the contents of your book, The Case for Zionism, and it's mind-boggling. But as Christians, to me, it's breathtakingly amazing to watch God at work. Just the things that he's doing right now are beyond historical.
Yeah, especially, we're recording this on the day that Netanyahu spoke to the United Nations, and in the last week or so, we've heard about how Lebanon has 120,000, 140,000 missiles. What's Israel going to do? How are they going to get rid of those? Well, guess what? They've knocked out half of them, from what I've read, and they haven't even officially gone to war. And they planted all these things that blew up the people's pagers, and they've done things on their computers that blow them up and all of this kind of stuff. They've killed over 500 people through those little things, not to mention targeting. You talk about targeting people. These were all the terrorists. And the ones that weren't killed were maimed for the rest of their life. They'll have to be taken care of. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
And so those Jewish people are really smart people, and they've been planning this for a year, and they were able to execute that. So I do not think that Russia and Gog and Magog is going to take place in the immediate future. And I think the fact that Iran, which Israel has threatened, they could demolish them with the nuclear bombs and everything if they were to attack them. Oh, yeah. Well, some do. But Israel has a neutron, which means it goes off, and 48 hours later, all the bad stuff is gone. And but nevertheless, Israel is not going to be destroyed, and we know that. We know it from Scripture. But the Iranians are going to be destroyed, I think, at the Battle of Gog and Magog, which I think, and I may be wrong, but...
Feel free. I will not contradict you in any way, but I'm very eager to hear what you think.
Well, I think it happens after the rapture, but before the tribulation starts.
Okay.
In that interval, and it removes the Islamic world from being a geopolitical factor. And obviously America seems to be going down, and so I think it's going to put the focus on Europe, which sets the stage for the Antichrist coming out of the revived Roman Empire, Europe.
And by the way, you have written on that subject and lectured on it, that the origin of the Antichrist is maybe a little different than most people think.
Well, he can't be an American.
Can't be an American, okay.
Yeah, so you have the 10 European nations that are going to be revived, And the Antichrist is going to head up that, and it talks about how he militarily defeats 3 of them, and then the other 7 come under his reign. And it says in Revelation how the book of Daniel and Revelation both says he's the 11th. In other words, as an individual from, I think, one of these 10 countries, he is going to create that covenant. See, it's a covenant between Israel and the revived Roman Antichrist. It's not, so any other covenant or agreement is not that which triggers the tribulation.
Very interesting, and very timely, by the way, because if you look at Europe, Europe is now undergoing a spiritual remodeling, if you will. The old Europe is sort of disappearing, and a new collectivist Europe is emerging.
Right. Yeah, at the top level, it's kind of like I've read and seen where there are revivals going on in Europe. That, of course, the media doesn't talk about it. But,
of course not.
And people are out preaching in major cities until the police come and make them quit. And that there have been a lot of people saved in Europe. And so that would mean a lot of these Catholics, for example, in France and places, are getting saved from the preaching of the gospel. And I think we're seeing generally around the world a time of all kinds of countries historically that have not really heard the gospel. Iran, believe it or not, they think as many as 3 million Christians there. That Iran has, and I don't want to get off on the details, but that there has been a move of God for the last 30 years in Iran.
Which you never hear about.
Right, but I happen to have a friend who lives in the Baltimore area, and the number 2 guy 40 years ago, his daughter was at the library, and she moved her foot, and she hit a Bible. And she picks it up and snuck it home and started reading it, and of course she gets saved.
No.
And she had an arranged marriage. She's supposed to get married, and that day, the guy she was marrying's sister came in the room and saw her reading the Bible, and the sister said, "I'm a Christian too," and so her father was going to have her killed when he found out that she was a Christian. But they smuggled her out, and she lives somewhere in the Baltimore area, I'm told. And so you have stories like this that have been going on, and they, like I say, they meet out in the woods, they do all kinds of stuff, and they have up, between 1.5 to 3 million believers in Iran.
As you're talking, I'm looking at chapter 9, the concluding chapter of your book, Lovers of Zion, A History of Christian Zionism. And that's sort of in keeping with what you're talking about here, Christian Zionism. Let's talk about that, because there's so much confusion right now in America and in Europe about how we relate to the Jews and to Israel.
Exactly. And part of that chapter, I talk about how the United States and many of our presidents early on were very pro-Israel, and they wanted to support Israel, or the Jews, before they became Israel. And we have that heritage, and that's why, the largest Jewish population in the world, up until recently, when Israel finally passed them, live in the United States, because we were filio-Semitic. In other words, we allowed all of it, especially the 1800s was the big time of immigration of Jewish people, into the United States. And of course they have, I've been to Brooklyn, and I've been there on the Sabbath when I've seen the Jews go walking to synagogue and various things like that. And, I think I told you earlier that when Late Great Planet Earth came out in 1970, back in the late 90s, I was at Hal Lindsey's house one day, and he was telling me that he had over 100,000 letters from Jewish people that got saved reading the Late Great Planet Earth.
Really? Now, that's fascinating.
It is.
Because when you and I would pick up that book and read it, that's kind of the last thing we'd be thinking of.
Right.
We're looking at prophecy through the eyes of Gentile Christianity. But there's another point of view.
Well, in fact, another friend of mine who's head of one of the major Jewish evangelism wrote his PhD dissertation at some was it New York University or no, that was Fruchtenbaum. It was somewhere in California on how between 1930 and 1940 how whole synagogues in Europe were coming to Christ. And I forget which country it was, but one of them had like 24% of all Jews had become believers. And they didn't start going to, Gentile churches. They were starting their own churches and everything. And there was this huge revival before 30. And so I can't help but think, Gary, that in those, when they were killing all the Jews, that a lot of these people who had already gotten saved were leading others to Christ in the death camps. Maybe 100,000 or something like that. And so God and all the leadership and all these people were wiped out in the Holocaust. It's interesting when you read history. There have been times of Christian revival among Jewish people.
The old phrase, in fact, my mother used to utter this on occasion: God works in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform. And I used to hear her say that, and it made me wonder, how does he do that? What's he doing? And that's exactly what we're talking about here.
But that last chapter, I spent a year and a half doing research exclusively showing. Most of my sources are from PhD dissertations that aren't published, showing the history of Christian Zionism.
The book is called A Case for Zionism, Dr. Thomas Ice. We who are familiar with him call him Tommy. Everybody calls you Tommy.
Right.
And that just suits you somehow. Very familiar. And Tommy, keep up the good work.
Well, thank you. It's good to be with you.
We are out of time, but I'm going to be looking forward to your next book or your next, whatever you produce is always interesting, and you are quite the researcher.
Well, I hope that the rapture comes next before I'm able to produce anything else.
Amen. We'll see you here, there, or
in the air.
In the air.